Do you remember those forgotten farmer dinners? The ones you could only find in old cookbooks, now buried like they never mattered? Back then, farmer dinners were slow, filling meals made from scratch, feeding tired hands and entire families after long days in the field. What changed in us that made meals like that disappear without a sound? If you grew up near a farmhouse or ever stepped foot inside a cold kitchen with the smell of navy beans and salted pork hanging in the air, then you know exactly what we are talking about. Dutch oven ham and bean supper was not just a dish, it was a whole day's labor packed into one heavy pot. You would soak your beans overnight, chop up whatever leftover ham bone you had stashed from last week's dinner, and toss in onions, garlic, and black pepper like it was the last flavor on earth. It simmered all afternoon, and the longer it cooked, the better it got. The ham hocks melted into the broth, the beans thickened into velvet, and the smell wrapped around the house like a wool blanket. It was especially loved during colder months, when heat and meat were both in short supply. And if there was any left the next day, which there rarely was, you could slap it between two thick pieces of cornbread and have yourself a meal all over again. You do not hear about parsnips much anymore. They are like the forgotten cousin of the carrot, slightly sweet, totally underrated, and at one time, a farm kitchen favorite. Pork and parsnip skillet bake was what families turned to when the root cellar was almost empty, but they still needed to put something warm and weighty on the table. Pork, especially the cheaper cuts like shoulder or belly, was browned in a cast iron skillet with onions and a little lard. Then the peeled parsnips went in, sliced thick and tossed in whatever broth or milk you had lying around. You would season it with sage or thyme if you were lucky, and bake the whole thing until the top browned just enough to get a little crispy. This was not a holiday meal. It was survival with soul. Parsnips stretched the dish and added a subtle sweetness that made the saltiness of the pork shine. It was farm logic at its finest. Make the most out of what you have and find comfort in the flavor. Back when freezers were a fantasy and meat was whatever wandered near your garden, rabbit was a regular part of the menu. It might sound unusual today, but buttermilk fried rabbit was once the kind of meal that made your mouth water as soon as it hit the pan. The rabbit would be cleaned and soaked in buttermilk for hours, sometimes overnight. This tenderized the meat and gave it that signature tang that fried food dreams are made of. Dredged in seasoned flour, then dropped into a hot cast iron skillet with bacon grease or lard, it came out golden, crispy, and impossibly juicy. The drippings were not thrown away either. That was your gravy base. Stir in a spoonful of flour and a splash of milk, and you had yourself a smooth, peppery sauce to spoon over the meat, or better yet, a biscuit. This was not everyday food. Rabbit was saved for when you had something to show for all your hard work, or when neighbors came over and you wanted to impress. Say what you will about simplicity, but cornmeal mush was nothing short of genius. It was cheap, filling, and could be made with three things almost every farmhouse had: cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. You would bring the water to a boil, stir in the cornmeal slowly to avoid lumps, and cook it down until it thickened into a porridge so dense it could hold its shape on a plate. Let it cool in a pan, slice it, and fry those slices in bacon drippings until they turned golden and crisp on the outside, while staying creamy and warm in the middle. Some families served it with molasses or syrup for breakfast. Others paired it with greens or beans for dinner. In southern kitchens, it was practically a rite of passage. And the bacon fat? That was liquid gold. It added flavor, texture, and just the right amount of indulgence to a meal that cost next to nothing. Cornmeal mush might not look like much, but it had everything a hardworking family needed. It stuck to your ribs and stretched a pantry farther than you thought possible. Cabbage and dumpling stew is what you made when the week was long, the weather was cold, and the pantry had more space than supplies. Cabbage, with its long shelf life and dependable bulk, was a farm family's best friend. Chop it up, throw it in a pot with a little salted water, and you were halfway to dinner. The dumplings were made from flour, eggs, and a bit of milk or water. Simple dough dropped right into the simmering pot to puff and soak up all the broth. If you had a ham bone or a bit of lard, it went in too, giving just enough richness to make it feel like more than boiled vegetables. It was not fancy, but it was filling. This dish found its way into American kitchens through immigrant traditions, especially German, Hungarian, and Polish families who settled in the Midwest. And it stuck around because it worked. You did not need meat to make it satisfying. There was a time when Hogmaw did not turn heads. It just meant dinner was ready. If you are not familiar with it, Hogmaw is the pig's stomach. Not exactly prime real estate on the animal, but it was clean, durable, and able to hold stuffing like a dream. In Pennsylvania Dutch country, it was called pig's stomach, plain and simple, and it was packed with diced potatoes, sausage, onions, and seasoning. You would stitch it shut and bake it low and slow until the skin crisped up and the inside turned soft and savory. It smelled incredible, and when you sliced it open, steam would pour out like a warm invitation. This dish was a tradition, passed down through generations of frugal, practical cooks who believed in using every part of the animal. And honestly, nothing went to waste. If you grew up on a farm, odds are you saw a Hogmaw at some point, even if you did not know what it was. It was a meal meant to feed many, made from parts most would throw away. But on the farm, waste was not an option. Flavor was found in the overlooked, and Hogmaw proved it. Milk gravy over fried salt pork might sound simple today, but it once ruled the breakfast and supper tables across countless rural households. Salt pork was cheap, shelf-stable, and salty enough to flavor just about anything. You would slice it thin, fry it crisp, and leave behind a pan full of drippings that could start 100 meals. For gravy, you would whisk in a bit of flour, pour in some milk, fresh if you had it, and stir until smooth. Pepper was your friend here. It added just enough bite to balance the richness. This was poured over everything from biscuits to mashed potatoes, even wilted greens. But more often than not, you served it with whatever you had, leftover bread, fried apples, or even boiled vegetables. It was not a luxury, but it was beloved. That gravy was the kind of thing that stuck with you, literally and figuratively. It coated your plate and stayed in your memory. In a world without fast food or grocery stores down the block, this kind of meal brought people together at the table and made the most of every ounce of effort. Egg noodle casserole with sour cream and leftover ham was one of those end-of-the-week miracles. It started with the realization that you had a little of this and a little of that, but not enough of anything on its own. So you boiled some egg noodles, mixed in that last scoop of sour cream, and tossed in whatever ham was left from Sunday's roast. Some versions added peas or onions, others used breadcrumbs or cheese on top. The whole thing baked into a bubbling, golden pan of comfort that tasted like it took hours, but came together in minutes. It was the kind of recipe you did not even need to measure. Just feel it out. It lived in the margins of old community cookbooks, written in pencil, adjusted for whatever life threw at you that month. And it always worked. Even when the pantry felt empty, this casserole made sure no one went to bed hungry. It was forgiving, flexible, and loved by every generation that passed it down. In a world where food waste was not an option, dishes like this were worth their weight in gold. Mock chicken legs, or city chicken, as some called it, might be the cleverest trick rural cooks ever pulled. It looked like fried chicken. It even tasted close. But there was not a single feathered friend in sight. These were skewers of pork or veal, cubed and threaded like kebabs, then breaded and fried or baked until crispy and golden. They were meant to mimic chicken drumsticks for families who could not afford the real thing. And here is the kicker: they worked. In blind taste tests, folks swore it was chicken. That is how good these were. You might find them listed in old recipe cards as Sunday treats, dressed up with gravy and mashed potatoes, or served plain with pickles and bread. Kids loved them, adults appreciated the savings, and everyone respected the ingenuity. It was cooking with humor, practicality, and a little sleight of hand. These mock chicken legs turned less into more, and no one left the table disappointed. Boiled dinner with turnips and neck bones was as plain as it sounded, and as satisfying as a meal could be. You did not need much to make it happen. Some neck bones, a few turnips, maybe a carrot or two, and a pot of salted water. The longer it boiled, the more the bones gave up their flavor and the vegetables soaked it in. It was slow food in the truest sense. No shortcuts, no gadgets, just time, patience, and heat. You might throw in a handful of barley or a chunk of cabbage if you had it, but you did not need to. The broth was rich, the turnips softened just enough, and the meat slid right off the bone. This kind of dish was common in old New England cookbooks, where winters were long and nothing could be wasted. It filled the house with warmth and the bellies with strength. And while it may never have made the cover of a magazine, it made an impression on every family who grew up with it. That is the kind of food that sticks with you. Molasses-baked sausage patties were the kind of dinner that made the whole house smell like someone had been cooking all day, even if it only took one pan and half an hour. Ground pork was mixed with breadcrumbs, dry mustard, black pepper, and just enough molasses to hold it all together. Rolled into thick patties, these went into the oven where the molasses caramelized around the edges, turning sweet and savory at once. The crust was dark, nearly burnt-looking, but that was the best part. Inside, the meat stayed tender. This was a southern staple, especially where molasses was cheaper than sugar. Some folks added vinegar for bite, others threw in a pinch of clove to warm it up. Whatever the twist, it was always eaten hot, usually with spoon bread or mustard greens. Leftovers went into biscuits the next morning. This was not fancy food. It was smart and full of that down-home flavor that sticks to your fingers and memory. No one forgot these patties, even long after the molasses jar ran dry. Stuffed peppers with wild rice and scrapple were the kind of dish that turned odds and ends into something that looked presentable. You started with green bell peppers, fat ones if you could find them, and sliced off the tops. The filling was hearty. Wild rice brought chew, while scrapple added that gritty, meaty richness you could not fake. Scrapple, made from pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices, was often looked down on today, but once considered resourceful. When mixed with rice and maybe a spoonful of tomatoes or chopped onion, it filled those peppers to the brim. Baked until the peppers softened and browned, they came out looking like a treat even if they cost next to nothing. Sometimes they were topped with breadcrumbs, other times just left plain, but they were always filling and tasted like fall on a plate. It was a perfect example of how farmers stretched what they had and made something beautiful. It might not be in modern cookbooks, but it held its own at the dinner table. Potato and egg gratin with onion butter was a meatless marvel that felt richer than it had any right to. Thin slices of potato were layered in a casserole dish, with slow-cooked onions and butter nestled between. On top went beaten farm eggs, poured gently to soak the layers. Some added cream if they had it. Others cracked whole eggs right on top and let them bake. The result was golden and velvety in the middle. It was the kind of dish that felt like brunch before anyone said that word. It had a little of everything: soft, crunchy, savory, and just indulgent enough. This gratin showed up when meat was too costly or saved for Sunday. It was a hit at barn suppers and church picnics, easy to cut and serve. Onion butter was the quiet star. It gave flavor and fat when there was little else. On a cold night, one bite was enough to keep you going till morning. That is how farmhouse families made it through. Sorghum glazed pork chops with skillet apples might sound fancy now, but they began in modest kitchens that had never even seen a restaurant. Sorghum syrup was the sweetener of choice before white sugar became widely available. Thick like molasses but mellow in flavor, it paired beautifully with pork. Chops were seared in cast iron, glazed with sorghum and vinegar. While they finished cooking, sliced apples went into the same pan, soaking up the glaze and softening into sweet, sticky bites. This was celebration food. Pork wasn't always around, but when it was, you made it count. That glaze gave it a finger-licking shine that made even cheap cuts feel special. Some added cinnamon, others spooned the apples over grits. The goal was always the same: stretch the good stuff and waste nothing. These kinds of combinations, sweet, savory, tender, crisp, weren't born in test kitchens. They came from lived experience, from families making magic with what they had. Baked oxtail pie with root vegetables was not for those in a rush. Oxtail took hours to tenderize, and every hour meant more flavor. First it was browned, then simmered with carrots, turnips, and onions until the meat slid right off the bone. The vegetables absorbed all that beefy flavor, creating a thick, dark stew full of soul. That stew went into a homemade crust, usually flour, lard, and effort, and was sealed with another crust on top. It baked golden, bubbling at the edges. You smelled it before you saw it. At the table, nobody spoke until plates were clean. This pie was a winter staple, especially in homes where no cut was wasted. Oxtail was scrap to some, but gold to those who knew better. It was food that demanded patience and rewarded it richly. Farm life taught those lessons young, and for anyone who remembers it, oxtail pie wasn't just a meal. It was proof that the best dishes often start with what others throw away. Cowboy beans with fatback and dried chilies were born on the trail but found a home in the farmhouse. They were rustic and strong, like the people who cooked them. Pinto beans soaked overnight were simmered slow with hunks of fatback that melted into smoky depth. Dried chilies brought heat, not overwhelming, but just enough to revive tired muscles. Sometimes garlic, sometimes onion, but always thyme. This dish couldn't be rushed. The longer it cooked, the richer it got. It became a staple in Western and Southwestern kitchens, served with cornbread or tortillas, whatever the land allowed. Beans were cheap, hearty, and full of protein, vital when meat was scarce. And fatback, often dismissed now, was once treasured for how far it could stretch. One pot could feed a family and leave leftovers. On cold nights, cowboy beans didn't just fill your stomach. They wrapped you up like a warm coat from the inside. Hoosier farmstead meatloaf with cornflake crust was as Midwestern as it gets. It was humble, dependable, and always showed up when you needed it most. Ground beef, or whatever blend of meat you had, was mixed with onion, egg, milk, and a handful of crushed cornflakes. No breadcrumbs here. The cornflakes gave it a sweet crunch that toasted perfectly in the oven. This meatloaf was baked in a sheet pan, not a fancy tin, and sliced into squares instead of thick rounds. It was easy to portion, easy to stretch, and even easier to love. You would often see it at community potlucks or church suppers, where it held its own beside casseroles and potato salads. Some folks added ketchup on top, others left it plain. But no matter the version, it always smelled like home. This dish came from a time when cereal was not just for breakfast. It was a pantry staple that made everything go further. In farm kitchens, nothing went to waste, and cornflakes were just another way to make do. The meatloaf may not have been glamorous, but it was reliable. And when your day started at sunrise, that kind of reliability mattered more than anything else. Onion and bacon Johnny cakes were the kind of meal that slipped in quietly and stole the show. Made from cornmeal batter poured straight onto a hot skillet, Johnny cakes were the backbone of many rural diets. But adding fried onions and chopped bacon took them from humble to unforgettable. The onions were slow cooked until golden, then folded into the batter with crispy bits of bacon. Each cake hit the griddle with a hiss and came out with browned edges and a fluffy center. You could eat them plain with syrup or next to a bowl of greens or beans. Some families made them small, like pancakes. Others spread them wide like a flatbread. Either way, they were always satisfying. In a time when flour could run out and yeast was hard to come by, cornmeal was king. And the addition of bacon and onion made the most basic meal feel warm, special, and a little bit indulgent. These Johnny cakes were dinner, breakfast, and everything in between. You did not need a reason to make them. Just a skillet, some grease, and a little bit of whatever you had left in the fridge. Creamed celery and potatoes sounds like something from a tea party, but back in the day, it was dinner for a family of 5. Celery was easy to grow, especially during late harvest when you had already used up most of your hearty vegetables. Potatoes, of course, were always in the bin. You would chop both up, boil them until soft, then cover the whole thing in a cream sauce made with butter, milk, and flour. If you had a bit of cheese, you might grate some on top. But even without it, the dish was rich and comforting. It was usually served hot with biscuits or toasted bread and scraped clean before it could cool. Celery gave a bright crunch that balanced the heaviness of the sauce, while the potatoes carried it all home. Meat might be missing, but no one left the table hungry. This kind of dish showed how you could eat well on very little. No fuss, no meat, no problem. Just warmth, thrift, and a sense of calm after a hard day. Creamed celery and potatoes reminded folks that flavor could come from the field, not just the butcher's counter. Pickle brine pork shoulder roast was not just a meal, it was a strategy. When vinegar was low and salt was tight, leftover pickle brine stepped up as a marinade that worked wonders. Farmers would save the brine from finished jars, pour it over a pork shoulder, and let it soak overnight. The result was meat that was tangy, tender, and packed with flavor from the garlic, dill, or spice lingering in the jar. It might sound odd, but it worked. Once roasted low and slow, the meat came out juicy with crispy edges and a faint pickle tang that made each bite more interesting than the last. Sometimes potatoes or carrots were roasted right alongside it, soaking up the juices and mellowing out the acidity. This was a roast with character. You did not need a glaze or rub or expensive herbs, just leftovers and a little faith in old wisdom. It was kitchen recycling at its finest, and no one ever turned down a plate of it. Pickle brine pork was a quiet triumph of farmhouse cooking, proof that sometimes the scraps held the best surprises. Turnip greens with smoked jowl and corn dumplings was a plate that didn't whisper comfort, it shouted it from the porch. The greens were earthy and sharp, simmered low and slow until they turned silky. But the real heart of the dish was the smoked jowl. That fatty, rich meat brought depth that no store-bought broth ever could. Just a small chunk made the whole pot taste like memory. And then came the corn dumplings, fluffy, gritty, and dropped straight into the greens to soak up all that smoky, peppery flavor. They weren't pretty, but they puffed up like clouds and filled bellies fast. This dish didn't need a side. It was the meal. It was what you made when money was tight but the garden was giving and the butcher knew your name. You could eat a bowl of it and feel the heat settle in your bones. It showed up at Sunday tables, funerals, and quiet weeknights alike. Today, it's rare to see greens cooked this way, let alone with dumplings soaking right in the pot. But for those who remember, one bite is all it takes to bring back the whole kitchen. Homemade sausage cakes with sorghum biscuits were the kind of meal that made morning chores feel just a little bit easier. The sausage was not store-bought. It was made by hand, right at home. Ground pork seasoned with salt, pepper, sage, and sometimes a hint of crushed red pepper. You shaped it into thick patties and pan-fried them until the edges crisped and the centers stayed juicy. On their own, they were satisfying. But paired with sorghum biscuits, that was something else. Sorghum syrup, sticky and dark, got mixed right into the biscuit dough or drizzled on top after baking. The sweetness cut the saltiness of the sausage perfectly, creating a balance that modern breakfasts just do not have. It was a meal for slow mornings, family gatherings, and cold days when you needed something hearty to start off right. These recipes lived in the backs of family cookbooks, sometimes handwritten in fading pencil. They were not flashy or fussy, just smart, comforting, and full of flavor. You did not need a restaurant. You just needed a skillet, some good sausage, and enough sorghum to leave your fingers sticky. Duck and onion stew with a vinegar splash was not an everyday kind of dinner. It was a once-in-a-season kind of event. Duck was not something you bought. It was something you hunted, cleaned, and cooked with care. When duck season came around, farm families who lived near wetlands or rivers might get their hands on a few birds, and this stew was how you made the most of them. You would sear the duck pieces in a pot to render the fat, then toss in sliced onions until they turned soft and sweet. Water or broth came next, followed by a splash of vinegar. Apple cider if you had it, plain white if you did not. That vinegar gave it brightness, cutting through the richness of the meat. You would let it simmer low and slow until the duck was fall-apart tender and the onions melted into the broth. Served with bread or potatoes, it was as close to luxury as most families got. It was also a reminder of self-reliance, of seasons passing, of how closely food was tied to the land. You could not fake your way through this one. It took skill, time, and a bit of luck. Green tomato hash with potatoes and fat drippings was what you made when summer was ending and the garden had one last breath left in it. Green tomatoes, those stubborn ones that would not ripen before the frost, were chopped up and tossed into a hot skillet with cubed potatoes and a good amount of leftover bacon or sausage drippings. It sizzled, it popped, and it made the kitchen smell like something was finally going right. This hash was not pretty, but it was packed with flavor. The tomatoes softened but kept their tang, the potatoes crisped at the edges, and the fat tied it all together with smoky depth. Some families added onions or garlic, others tossed in bits of ham or corn if they had it. But at its core, this was about using what would otherwise go to waste. It was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever you needed it to be. Served hot from the pan with a fried egg or a slice of leftover cornbread, it hit the spot every time. It was farm cooking at its smartest. No rules, no frills, just flavor from the ground up. Baked mushrooms in cream and breadcrumbs might sound like a side dish, but back then, it stood on its own. When meat was hard to come by and protein had to come from somewhere else, mushrooms stepped up to the plate. You would gather or buy them in bulk, often button or cremini, and slice them thick. Tossed in a baking dish with cream or milk, some softened onions, and a bit of flour for thickness, the mixture was topped with a generous layer of seasoned breadcrumbs. The whole thing baked until bubbling, golden, and rich. It was warm, earthy, and satisfying in a way that belied how simple it really was. If you had cheese, you might sprinkle a little in. If not, the breadcrumbs browned just fine on their own. This dish was often served with boiled potatoes or crusty bread to scoop up the sauce. It was not elegant, but it was efficient. A full meal made from fungi, fat, and filler, and no one complained. It reminded people that luxury is relative, and comfort can come from the humblest of places. Pinto bean loaf with chili spice glaze was the Depression-era answer to meatloaf, and in some ways it was even better. You took whatever beans you had, pinto being the most common, mashed them with breadcrumbs, diced onions, and a few beaten eggs to bind it all together. Formed into a loaf shape and baked, it came out sturdy, sliceable, and surprisingly rich. But the real star was the glaze. Made from homemade chili sauce, usually a mix of tomato, vinegar, sugar, and spice, it got brushed over the top before baking and again just before serving. The edges caramelized, the flavors deepened, and every bite hit that sweet, salty, spicy mark that made you forget there was no meat at all. This loaf fed whole families and still left enough for sandwiches the next day. It was a miracle of thrift, taste, and ingenuity. In the right kitchen, with the right cook, it could be just as beloved as its beefy counterpart, maybe even more, because it stood for something more than just dinner. It stood for resilience, creativity, and full bellies in hard times. Boiled chicken with vinegar and dumplings was a master class in stretching one bird as far as it could possibly go. You would take a whole chicken, sometimes old, sometimes small, and boil it until the meat loosened from the bone. The broth was seasoned with salt, pepper, and a generous pour of vinegar, which gave the dish a bright, almost pickled tang that cut through the fat. Once the meat was removed and shredded, dumplings went in. Soft dough dropped into the hot broth and cooked until fluffy and tender. These dumplings soaked up all the flavor, turning into savory little clouds you could eat by the dozen. The chicken went back in, now shredded and sparse, but somehow it was enough. The broth was rich, the dumplings were hearty, and no one left the table wanting more. It was not flashy, but it was effective. This was how farm families survived long winters and longer weeks. It used what was on hand, respected every part of the bird, and fed many with little. That kind of cooking has a quiet wisdom to it. Mashed turnip and bacon bake was not the kind of dish you dreamed about, but it was the one you asked for again. Turnips were easy to grow and even easier to store, lasting through the cold months when the rest of the produce had disappeared. Peeled, boiled, and mashed with butter, they were then folded together with bits of crisp bacon and poured into a baking dish. Topped with breadcrumbs or more bacon fat, the dish was baked until golden and bubbling at the edges. It was smoky, savory, and had just enough bitterness from the turnips to remind you this was farm food, not diner fare. Served with black bread or a fried egg, it could carry you through a whole evening without a second thought. This was not a celebration meal, but it was a regular one, and over time, it grew on you. The kind of dish that years later still shows up in memory, even if the recipe was lost, because it was practical, filling, and full of flavor that came from the land, not the label. Hominy stew with lard and leftover pork was what happened when you had nothing but still needed something warm to fill a pot. Hominy, dried corn kernels treated with lye, was cheap, shelf-stable, and dense enough to stick with you for hours. It went into a big pot with water, a spoonful of lard for flavor and fat, and whatever pork trimmings you could find, bones, scraps, even rinds. As it simmered, the broth grew thicker, the hominy softened, and the pork let go of every bit of flavor it had left. You might add a bay leaf or some dried herbs if they were nearby, but you did not need them. This was peasant food at its best, simple, hearty, and deeply satisfying. It was the kind of dish that reminded you to be grateful for a roof and a hot meal. It stretched well, reheated even better, and left you full in a way only old food can. In a time when nothing came easy, hominy stew kept people going with its humble magic. Beef heart with onion gravy and parsley potatoes is not something you see on menus now, but once it was the sign of a cook who knew exactly what they were doing. The heart was cleaned, sliced, and braised low and slow until it turned tender, something between steak and liver, but milder and more filling. Meanwhile, onions were caramelized in the same pan, and flour was added to the drippings to make a rich brown gravy that carried the essence of every bite. Served with boiled parsley potatoes, soft on the inside, green-flecked and buttery on the outside, it became a full, well-rounded meal. The kind of thing that felt like you were eating high on the hog, even though it came from one of the cheapest cuts. Beef heart was never waste, not in a household that respected animals, effort, and food. And onion gravy? That was how you stretched flavor into something worth remembering. You did not need steak to eat well. You just needed time, care, and a willingness to work with what others left behind. That was the farm kitchen way. Smoked ox tongue with mashed parsnips was a dish that asked for patience, not approval. The tongue, large and leathery before cooking, was scrubbed, brined, and smoked slowly until it sliced like deli meat but tasted deeper, richer, like beef turned inside out. The parsnips, pale cousins to the carrot, were boiled and mashed with butter and a pinch of salt, offering their own subtle sweetness to counter the savory meat. On a cold night, this meal filled the room with steam and the air with the scent of something hearty. It was not glamorous, but it was proud. A dish that used what was available and turned it into something memorable. You did not serve ox tongue to impress. You served it because it was yours to work with. On the farm, nothing went to waste. Every part of the animal had a purpose. And this part, once smoked and sliced, could last through several meals. Tongue has vanished from most plates, and parsnips are more often passed over than picked. But for those who knew how to cook with care, this was a dish that fed more than just hunger. It fed resilience, and it fed family. Gooey buttercake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for two reasons. Gooey buttercake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter, meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis gooey butter cake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Cold ham loaf with spiced apple rings and gelatin salad was Sunday lunch without the oven. The ham loaf, pink, pressed and slightly sweet, was sliced thin and served cold, like a meatloaf that never saw heat. Alongside it came apple rings, spiced with cinnamon and clove, stewed until they were tender and fragrant like pie filling. The gelatin salad sat trembling in its mold, packed with shreds of carrot or bits of celery, sweet and strange and somehow expected. This was a plate you saw on pastel-colored plastic trays, or at church gatherings with mismatched forks. White bread on the side, maybe a thick smear of yellow mustard, and a pickle spear for punctuation. It was cooling food for hot kitchens, a way to serve something that felt full without ever lighting the stove. Ham loaf has all but vanished, and gelatin salads are more joke than joy these days. But for those who grew up with them, this was the taste of a summer table: cold plates, quiet fans, and nowhere to be but home. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. Sour cream and onion-fried cabbage cakes were born from boredom. You can only eat boiled cabbage so many ways before you start to rebel, even during rationing. So clever hands found a way to reinvent the leftover greens, chopped finely, mixed with mashed potatoes, onion, and a scoop of sour cream, then pan-fried until crisp and golden. What emerged was somewhere between a latke and a hush puppy, tender in the middle and whispering with steam. These little cakes were served plain with applesauce or next to whatever protein was available, though they could hold their own as a meal. You could smell them cooking from outside the house, especially in winter when anything fried seemed like a gift from the heavens. These days, cabbage has gone back to being either raw in salads or lost in a soup pot. But once, it was the star of the skillet, crisping in bacon grease and proving that even leftovers could become legends. For soldiers on the march, portability was everything, and few foods were as reliable as bread and cheese. Roman legionnaires famously carried flat loaves of bread and wedges of hard cheese, often made from sheep or goat's milk. The combination was a nutritional powerhouse, carbs for energy and protein for strength, all in a package that could survive the harsh conditions of a campaign. But let's not romanticize it. The bread was often dense and tough, more akin to a brick than a baguette. Soldiers sometimes had to soak it in water or wine just to make it chewable. The cheese wasn't the creamy delight you'd find at a deli. Aged for durability, It leaned more toward rock hard than velvety soft. Still, when paired together, they made a meal that was surprisingly satisfying and, most importantly, long-lasting. In medieval times, knights and foot soldiers kept the tradition alive, carrying wheels of cheese and hearty loaves during long marches. Back then, breaking bread wasn't just a saying, it was a literal act of survival. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but when the choice is between stale bread and hunger, even a Roman would tell you, the bread wins every time. Chipped beef in cream over fried grit cakes was a Southern solution to a national problem. During World War II, meat was rationed, and frugality ruled every kitchen. Chipped beef, dried, salty slivers of preserved beef, was a staple in both military rations and rural homes. Rehydrated in a skillet with cream, butter, and a little black pepper, it became a thick, rich gravy that could dress up anything. Instead of toast, farmers in the South used fried grit cakes, leftover grits chilled in a pan, sliced into squares and crisped in bacon fat until golden. The result was crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and perfect for soaking up that creamy meat sauce. This dish was known by many names, some polite, some not. But it was beloved all the same. It made something out of nothing. A handful of meat, a little milk, and yesterday's grits became a breakfast or supper that stuck to your bones. Chipped beef may be harder to find now, and grit cakes have been replaced by packaged everything. But this was food that made the most of what you had, and never apologized for it. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Egg noodle and sauerkraut bake with caraway and leftover roast was about making meat go the distance. You took the last slices of Sunday roast, beef, pork, or whatever you had, and chopped them fine. Mixed into a casserole dish with buttery egg noodles, tangy sauerkraut, a little sour cream, and a pinch of caraway seed, it baked into something warm, filling, and deeply familiar. The top crisped, the noodles browned, and the whole dish smelled like a crossroads between old world and new farm. It was a dish born from thrift, but also from memory. German and Eastern European immigrants brought the flavors of sauerkraut and caraway with them, and those tastes settled into the soil of American farmland. This bake became a regular in the Midwest and Appalachia, places where nothing got thrown out, and second-day meals were often the best of the week. Today, we throw out leftovers without a thought, but once they were the start of something even better. This dish proved that with the right touch, yesterday's scraps could taste like a holiday. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Cold buttermilk soup with diced cucumbers and dill was a farmhouse secret to beating the heat. When summer came heavy and the cows barely stirred, This bowl of chilled, tangy comfort brought back your appetite and your energy. The buttermilk was sharp and sour, cut with a little cream if you had it, and filled with crisp slices of fresh cucumber straight from the garden. Chopped dill added a clean green bite that lingered on the tongue. Sometimes a hard-boiled egg or a few boiled potato cubes were stirred in for body. You poured it into chipped bowls and ate it with a spoon that clinked against the sides, the coldness rushing through your chest like a breeze across open fields. It was quiet, it was rural, and it was practical. No stove, no baking, just assembly. But somewhere between air conditioning and fast food, this little bowl of cold clarity disappeared. Today it might seem too old world, too odd, but it was the kind of food that felt like a cool cloth across your forehead. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Salt pork and vinegar slaw sandwiches were never meant to be pretty. They were greasy, sharp, and a little sloppy, just the way a long workday demanded. Salt pork was cheap and powerful, pan-fried into crispy edges that snapped like bark when you bit into them. The vinegar slaw was a raw mix of cabbage, onion, maybe some carrot, and always a healthy pour of white vinegar with just a pinch of sugar to soften the sting. It cut through the fat, woke up your taste buds, and made even dry bread feel alive again. Farmers packed them in wax paper and stuffed them into shirt pockets or saddlebags, where the sandwich would warm slightly by lunch but still taste just right. Salt pork has mostly vanished from store shelves now, and vinegar slaw gave way to creamier versions that missed the point entirely. But once upon a time, this sandwich fed the backbone of rural America. Salty, sour, satisfying to the very last bite. Rabbit liver and onions with sorghum-baked cornbread was not just brave, it was respectful. On the farm, nothing went to waste, especially not the liver, which was tender, iron-rich, and deeply flavored. It was soaked in milk to soften its bite, then seared with onions until it browned at the edges and melted in the middle. Next to it came the sorghum cornbread, a slightly sweet, dense bread made with stone-ground cornmeal and thick black syrup, baked until the crust browned and cracked. Kids often hated it, but as you grew older, so did your taste for it. Rabbit liver was harder to clean, smaller than other kinds, but somehow more delicate too. Today, it is almost impossible to find, and even those who hunt rarely keep it. But back then, this dish was a mark of respect to the animal, to the meal, to the cook. It was about making something honest and filling from what others would throw away, and in that quiet pride, it became a favorite. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Milk toast with fried apples and black pepper was a meal for bad days. When money was tight or someone was sick, you made it because it was warm, soft, and kind. Milk toast on its own was simple. Toasted bread soaked in hot milk, sometimes sweetened, sometimes salted. Add fried apples, sliced thin, cooked in butter with a bit of cinnamon. and suddenly you had contrast. The apples brought texture and memory, while a little cracked black pepper gave it just enough edge to wake you up. This was food for children, for the elderly, for anyone who needed something gentle but real. It was cheap, fast, and always on hand. Some families added a spoon of sugar, others swore by a pinch of nutmeg, but the core remained the same: warmth over bread. It was meant to take care of you. And for many who grew up with it, that first bite of milk-softened bread and caramelized apple still tastes like love in its quietest form. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Old-fashioned boiled dinners with ham hocks and turnips were not exciting. They were essential. You put everything in one pot: smoked hocks, peeled turnips, carrots, onions, sometimes a potato or two, and let it all bubble until the bones softened and the broth turned cloudy with fat and salt. This was winter food, designed for nights when the wind rattled the windows and you could see your breath indoors. Turnips were bitter, ham hocks were bony, but together they became something healing. No frills, no garnish, just steam rising from chipped bowls as the family crowded close to eat. You would pick at the bones, slurp the broth, maybe add a slice of hard bread to mop it all up. It was about making a little meat stretch a long way and letting the vegetables do most of the work. But they carried a kind of rhythm, a quiet wisdom passed from hand to hand. They taught us that you do not need much to feel full, just heat, time, and the will to make something from nearly nothing. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Baked salsify with cheddar crumbs was a dish from a time when vegetables had character, when dirt-covered roots with strange names were regulars at the table. Salsify, also known as oyster plant, grew easily in cooler climates and was dug from the ground with care, its long white taproot looking more like something from a witch's pantry than a grocery shelf. But peeled and boiled, it softened into something creamy and nutty, with a hint of the sea, hence the nickname. It was laid into buttered pans, topped with breadcrumbs and sharp cheddar cheese, then baked until golden and bubbling. This was not a dish for guests. It was quiet food, food that tasted better than it looked. In farmhouse kitchens, it was served as a side or sometimes as the main course when meat was scarce. Supermarkets do not stock it, and few people even know its name. But for those who remember, this dish was a lesson in not judging a food by its first appearance. Beneath the dirt was something worth savoring. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, saute them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it, a perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Chicken feet and dumplings with collard green broth made sure nothing went to waste. Every part of the bird was used, and the feet, once cleaned and simmered, released a gelatin that thickened the soup and made it silky. The dumplings were flour and fat, dropped by spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, soaking up all the flavor like sponges of survival. The broth was built on collard greens, wilted and steeped until they lent their earthiness to every bite. This was not a fancy dinner, it was a necessary one. In black farming communities across the South, this dish was standard, hearty, humble, and rich with culture. It was the kind of food that looked thin in the bowl but sat heavy in the belly. Today, we have forgotten the skill it takes to coax nourishment out of the neglected parts of the pantry. But this meal, every last finger bone and dumpling, was a lesson in gratitude, ingenuity, and care. Roasted chicken necks and backs with barley and leeks was a recipe that turned scraps into treasure. The necks and backs, too small for most, held pockets of rich meat and skin that melted into the pot with time. Roasted low and slow, they gave up every bit of flavor, transforming water into broth and barley into something more than just grain. The leeks were sliced thin and cooked until sweet, their gentle bite curling around every spoonful. This dish was not about presentation. It was about intention. You started it in the morning and served it at dusk, knowing the pot had done the work for you. It made something out of what others threw away, and in farm kitchens, that was as close to magic as you could get. Today, these parts are discarded or sold for pennies, but back then, they were dinner. They were comfort in a world that offered little else. And when the barley soaked up every last drop of golden broth, it felt like you had won something. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Pickled beet and hard-boiled egg supper plates did not need heat to feel warm. You pulled them straight from the icebox on a Sunday night, when the fire was low and nobody wanted to scrub another pot. The eggs were dyed purple by the beets, steeped together in vinegar and sugar for a day or more until the whites turned magenta and the yolks mellowed out. It was a farmer's version of elegance. These dishes were common after church, laid out with cold biscuits left over from breakfast, a few slices of cheese if you were lucky, and sometimes a spoonful of jam on the side for balance. It was quiet food. Humble, yes, but not boring. The tartness of the beets, the soft salt of the eggs, the crumb of biscuit still holding on. It was all done with intention. And while the beets and eggs were simple, their flavor lingered long after the plates were cleared. We traded meals like this for convenience and forgot what it meant to feel fed without fuss. Potato and onion pone with buttered collards was a skillet meal with soul. Cornmeal formed the base, mixed with mashed potatoes, shredded onion, salt, and a bit of bacon grease, then packed into a cast iron pan and baked until the edges were crisp and the middle was dense and steamy. The top crackled as it cooled, and the scent was somewhere between cornbread and roasted hash. Next to it came the collards, cooked low and slow with a pat of butter, maybe a chunk of ham bone if you had one. The greens were dark and silky, the broth salty and rich, spooned over the pone like gravy. It was not a fancy dinner, but it was deeply satisfying. Hot, thick, and filling. You could feed a field worker on one plate and know they would make it through until dawn. Potato and onion pone has faded away, replaced by boxed mixes and frozen sides. But once, it was the crown jewel of cast iron, crusted at the bottom and steaming at the top. A reminder that even the simplest ingredients could shine with heat and time. If any of these farm dinners made you smile, drop a memory in the comments, tap like with flour-dusted fingers, and subscribe for more forgotten meals worth remembering.